In this Limud Be'ezra Hashem, we will attempt to summarize the key approaches that the Rishonim have in understanding the din that a ta'roives, a mixture which contains in it chameshes minim, requires a boire mine mezainis. If we begin once again with the Gemara on page 4 of the famous book, the Gemara records a machlokes in the case of Daisa Ke'ein Chavitz Kedera, page 4 of the famous Lavan Dovim Beis, the penultimate of the narrow lines in the Gemara. Chavitz Kedera, Rabbi Yehuda Omar Shahakoil. Rabbi Yehuda says the bracha Shahakoil Sovar Duvsha Iker. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that Gvash, whose bracha Shahakoil is the Iker of this Daisa Ke'ein Chavitz Kedera. On the other hand, Rav Kahana Omar, Boire Mine Mezoinos, Sovar Simida Ikar. Rav Kahana says the bracha is Boire Mezoinos because the Simida, because the flour is Ikar. Omar Rav Yosef, Kavosid Rav Kahana Mistavra, the halacha follows Rav Kahana, the Rav Shmuel, the Omar Tavayu, Sheyesh by Mechameshes Hamine, Mevarchim Olo Boire Mine Mezoinos. Just in the straightforward reading of the Gemara, the Pnei Yeshua explains that in terms of the preparation of the Daisach in Chavitz Kedera, if we would apply the universal rules of Iker and Tofel, then Dvash would certainly be considered the Iker and the bracha would be Sha'kol Nia Bidvar. Therefore, when Rav Kahana says that the bracha should be very minimizanis because he says Simida Iker, we now have a very basic question. What does that mean? Does that mean that Chameshes Minim defy the rules of Iker and Tofel? And even if you would apply the rules of Iker and Tofel, the Smida, the Kemach, would not be considered Iker, but for reasons that will possibly suggest, nonetheless, the bracha remains Boire Mine Mezoinos? Or are we saying that because Kemach has unique properties, it by definition becomes the Iker, and that does conform with the principles of Iker and Tofel? The Pnei Yeshua seems to imply, and we'll come back to the Pnei Yeshua again, the first way, that the chashivus of Chameshes Minim allow Chameshes Minim to defy the rules of Iker and Tofel. And therefore, when the Gemara says that Rav Kahana din that the bracha should be very mezonos sava smida ikar, it doesn't mean smida ikar because in the rules of ikar and tofel, kemach becomes the smida, the kemach becomes ikar, but kemach is by definition ikar in terms of hilchas brachas because chameshes minim defies the dinim of ikar and tofel. And the Pnei Yeshua suggests two reasons why that should be. He says either because chameshes minim have a chashivus, they have an inherent superiority, a prominence in terms of their chashivos. And the reason for that, says the Pnei Yeshua, is because we're Mekayim with Chameshes Minim the din of Chala, we're Yotze with them the mitzvah of Matzah, we can, on Chameshes Haminim, there's a mitzvah doraisa of Birchas Hamazon, and therefore Kemach is always considered Iker, it's considered prominent in a Tareim. One possibility. The second possibility that Pnei Yeshua says is because Kemach has a unique property that the same way as it says that lechem is the ikr mozon of a person, but chameshes minim is the ikr mozon of a person. Therefore, says the Pnei Yeshua, the reason why in a taroives Kemach would be ikr is because of its property of mozon. So two suggestions. The Pnei Yeshua says the reason why in his reading of the Gemara Chameshes Minim defy the principles of Tofel ve'ikr for one of two reasons, either because of the inherent chashivos or because of the fact that it has the property of mazon. Yeah. The Pnei Yeshua goes on to make the following assumption to decide between these two possibilities. He says that in the case of a ta'aroives, the case where chameshes minim have been mixed into something else, even in a case where the other mean will be the majority of the ta'aroives. As we'll see, the Gemara still says that the chameshes minim remain ikr. Zot the Pnei Yeshua, if the chashivos of chameshes minim was as a result of mozoin, then in the case of a ta'aroives, if the other mean, not the mean of chameshes minim, was roiv, then in that case we would assume, says the Pnei Yeshua, that the chameshes minim no longer have the capacity to be mazen, because the roiv is of something else, and the chameshes minim are a miut, and they are b'ta'aroives. Therefore, says the Pnei Yeshua, if the din of kol sheyesh boy, the halacha of Rabbi Shmuel, that as long as there is chameshes minim in the ta'aroives, the brachas b'rei minim mezonos, that would imply that the reason why chameshes minim have the din of an ikr is just because of their chashivos. Their mere presence is kaveh the din of bracha. So to summarize, the Pnei Yeshua says that if we apply the dinim of ikr and tofel to the case of the Gemara of Daisok in Chavetz, then in the terms of ikr and tofel, dvash would be the ikr. The reason why Rav Kahana says kemach is an ikr is not because in the principles of ikr and tofel say that the kemach should remain an ikr, but the reason is because kemach is inherently choshev. Says the Pnei Yeshua for one of two reasons: either because it has the properties of mozain, or because one is mekayim with it mitzvahs. Says the Pnei Yeshua, if we see that even if the dvash would be ikr and the roiv, still the bracha would be minim mezonos, and presumably in that case the chameshes minim would no longer have the property of mozain. Therefore, we see that it's the chashivos which determines the bracha. That's the psicha, the hagdama that the Pnei Yeshua makes to the sugi. What we'll try and show in this limud is what is evidence from the Rishonim is different than what the Pnei Yeshua suggests from the straightforward reading of the Gemara. What we'll see from the Rishonim is, in fact, chameshes minim do conform to the rules of ikr and tofel, but it's just because of the unique properties of chameshes minim that allows them to establish ikr and tofel in a different way than other ta'aroives, as we'll see. Let's first begin with the lashon of the Rambam, page 145 in the Maramakanis. And we'll see from a basic reading of the Rambam that the Rambam seems to imply this very point, that in fact chameshes minim completely conforms to the dinim of ikr and tofel.
Dominates.
I didn't use the word dominate. No,
Dominates.
so it conforms to the rule of ikr and tofel. We'll begin with the Rambam in Perek Gimel Halacha Gimel. So the Rambam first brings the halacha that kemach shal echad mechameshes aminim, flour of one of the chameshes minim, sheshalku v'irvu b'mayim oy b'sham ashkim, it was mixed with water or other liquids. Im hoya ove kedei she'roi lachila lo yasay mevarach ala b'tchila bari minim ezanis. That's a preparation of kemach of chameshes minim, the basic halacha that the tabshel of chameshes minim, if it's eaten and not drunk, the din is bari minim ezanis. Then the Rambam continues, kemach shal echad mechameshes minim shebishla b'kedeira bein levadoi, whether it was cooked alone, bein she'irvoim dvarim acherim, whether it was mixed with other things, v'chein dogon shecholko yakotcho, or even the grain themselves that was crushed.
What would the modern day equivalent of the bee bites would be?
Pancake.
Pancake.
A pancake.
Right?
Yeah, pancake. Yeah. V'chein adogon shecholko yakotcho bishla b'kedeira, in rifa is garas caramel v'chayotze b'hem. Sewa nikra ma'isa kedeira. V'chein kol tavshel she'iru by mechameshes haminim bein kemach bein pas v'tchila mevarach olav boirei mine mezonos. So the Rambam has established the halacha of cooking kemach into a tavshel. That would be like a porridge kind of preparation. Then the Rambam goes on to say what happens if that kemach was cooked with other minim. So there the Rambam says, Kol tavshel she'iru by mechameshes haminim ben kemach ben pas has a bari minim mezonos. Now the Rambam qualifies that. That's only if it's choshuv v'lo hoya tefela, and it wasn't tofel. Avalim hoya echad mechameishes haminim she'irav tefela, einay mevarach ela ala iker upoiter es hatefela. The zeh klal bebrachos, and this is the rule, general rule in brachos. Kol shu iker v'imoy tefela, mevarach ala iker upoiter es hatefela. Says the Rambam that the general rule of brachos applies to chameshes haminim as much as it applies to any other tarovis. If the chameshes minim are iker, then the bracha follows the iker. If the chameshes minim are tofel, then the bracha is the bracha of a tofel. So it seems clear from the Rambam that the din of chameshes haminim in a tarovis is no different than anything else. It depends on the general principle of iker and tofel. There's no exception to chameshes haminim. Keitza, now the Rambam gives us illustrations. Keitza di atfela hamureves kigoin lefes oy kruv shabishla v'iruv by kemach shal echel chameshes minim kedei ledabek. If the chameshes minim was only mixed in order for it to bond the tavshil, eina mivarech alav. Shal lefes iker. Shekol dover shema'arim ledabek harei zetfela. Avalim iruv kedei litin tam b'taroives harehu iker. The Fikach says the Rambam, Mine dvash shemavashel moisev v'noisim emchelev chita v'oisim mine mesika einem mevarach alei barim menuzenis mipnei shehadvashu iker. Says the Rambam that if the kemach was placed ledabek, then it's by definition a tofel. But if it wasn't placed ledabek, then the Rambam says then the kemach is an iker. Why does it become an iker? Zot the Rambam, because in Erev kedei liting tam b'tarovis, it's an iker. Nesinas tam and tarovis is an iker. So clearly from the hemshech of the Rambam, we see that la'arav chameshes haminim is no different than the ordinary dinim of ikr and tofel. But somehow what the Rambam has said is that chameshes haminim has a maila that where it's mixed in the tavshil for the purposes of tam, that by definition makes it an ikr. But it should be said that din, and we'll return to that in shortly, that din that if something is put into a tavshil latam and therefore becomes nikir is not unique to the dinim of kemach. We'll see Be'ezer Hashem behemshech that there are other cases of that the Shulchan Aruch discusses where something can be mixed in a tavshil latam, and the fact that it will be the taste enhancer of the tavshil gives it a din of ikr, and we'll come back to that. But for the moment, what we see from Shittas Rambam is that whereas the Pnei Yeshua said in the straightforward reading of the Gemara that chameshes minim defies the dinim of ikr and tofel, the Rambam seems to say that chameshes minim conforms with the dinim of ikr and tofel. Just the chiddush is that chameshes minim, even if it's placed only for tam, remains an ikr. But the Rambam is mavur that in terms of the din, it's the same. Just chameshes minim have a property that allows them to remain ikr in a case of just being placed for tam alone. Not because of the specific chashivos, but because that's the unique way in which chameshes haminim become ikr. Not the Pnei Yeshua. That's what the straightforward reading of the Rambam is mavur. So we'll get to that. We'll see. We'll get to all those practical.
If I put spices in to give a different flavor,
as we'll see what happens. We'll see if it's what the din will be, if it's what's called murgash or not murgash. But as long as the tam of the kamach is can be sensed, tasted, that the Shittas Rambam, as we'll see in the place, that would conform.
So the English word for Latima is Latima.
We'll get to be magdir Latima more accurately as we go on.
The English word for
Latima will be to flavor.
To flavor
it. Yes. Yeah.
Flavor.
So this is the shita of the Rambam, in which we're showing that the dinim of chameshes minim conform to the dinim of ikr tofel, but somehow the unique properties create dinim and tofel halachas which we otherwise wouldn't expect with other cases of taroives. And therefore, what we'll try and show as we continue are different ways in which the Rishonim find in chameshes minim what makes chameshes minim unique, that they create dinim which we ordinarily wouldn't expect in dinim of ikr tofel, and in this case they do. So let's briefly just define the parameters of Iker and Tofel and Tarovis in general, and then we'll see how the Rishonim apply them specifically to Chameshes Aminim. So, for example, in the classic presentation of a Tarovis, we ordinarily expect that Roiv and Miut is defined based on, Iker and Tofel, is defined based on Roiv and Miut. So if we have a Tarovis, we expect that the Iker, which will define the bracha of the Tarovis, would be the majority, and the Miut would by definition be considered a Tofel. That we will learn Be'ezer Hashem in the Sugya on Daf Lamed Zayin, that when there is a Tarovis, for example, of Oiraz, which we will learn in the Sugya on Lamed Zayin, mixed with another Tavshil, the Rishonim established based on the Gemara that the bracha is determined by the Roiv. Now, what we'll see is in the case of Chameshes Aminim, that even if the Kemach, the Chameshes Aminim, is a Miut, the bracha will still be defined by the Chameshes Aminim. And this will be mafurish in a moment in the Rosh, and therefore we'll have to understand why the Chameshes Minim remain in Iker. Another instance where we find a Tarovis, which defines what the Iker in the Tarovis will be, is we find Iker Kavonosoi is on one of the elements of the Tarovis. Where do we find that? We learned that sugya in the sugya of Shemen and Anigrain. That there the Rishonim are mavur that if the Iker Kavona is for Shemen, even if the majority would be Anigrain, the bracha would be Boyer Prihait. So we see in a case of Tarovis, even where the Roiv may be something else, the bracha which will be determined by the Iker can be a case of Iker Kavanosai for that. So now we already sense a possibility of explaining why Chameshes Minim are an Iker, because we can say even in the case of a Miut, his Iker Kavana is for the Chameshes Minim. In other words, and now let's be clear, the Pnei Yeshua tells us that as long as there's Chameshes Minim in the Tarovis, it defies the dinim of Iker and Tofel. What we're looking for is a way to explain why the Chashivas of Iker of Tofel allows it to uniquely have a din of Iker. So here we have a possibility. Perhaps the fact that Chameshes Minim are Zon means that when I'm eating Chameshes Minim, even in the Tarovis, my intent of consuming the Tarovis is to gain the Chameshes Minim that are part of it. So then we could say Iker Kavanosoi is for the Chameshes Minim. So when the Rav Kahana said Chovitz Ke'ein Daisa, Rabbi Huda said Dvash Iker, meaning the Dvash is the Roiv, and therefore applying the basic principle of Iker Tofel, the Bracha Shviya Shahako. Says Rav Kahana, the reason why Smida is Iker is because one's Iker Kavana is for the Kemach in it. Because whenever one consumes something that's Zon, my Kavana is to benefit from the Zon. That's one possibility. And we'll show in the Rishonim, there are Rishonim that seem to understand the sugya that way. But the key point is that even though we have an unexpected din of Iker and Tofel and Chameshes Minim, it doesn't defy the parameters of Chameshes Minim. It conforms with the parameters of Chameshes Minim for unique reasons. Let's see another instance. Another instance we mentioned before, where something is Latam Avida. We have an example, we'll learn it Be'ezer Hashem when we learn further in Hilchos Bichas HaPeiros. It's primarily brought in the Mechaber in the end of Siman Reish Daled, that even if there's a Roiv and a Miut, if something is the dominant tam of the Tarovis, so it was placed in the Tarovis, so that should be the discernible flavor of the Tarovis, that also can make it Iker, even if it's not conforming with the rules of Roiv and Miut, because where the intent was that should be the tam of the Tarovis, that also establishes Iker. So again, we can possibly suggest a similar application in the case of Chameshes Minim, that the Chashivos would mean that they are the primary tam of the Tarovis. And therefore, again, the bracha would follow, and we'll see other Rishonim suggest that possibility. Then, another possibility which we find is the concept of lalafes, where something is being eaten to enhance something else. Lalafes, lifton. The classic application of lifton is where everything that's brought in a Suda, on which one was Beitzei pas, and which one began with Achila of Pas, all Achila is considered Lelafes Sapas. It's all considered to enhance the eating of the Pas, the Ikka Suda of the Pas. But we find other applications where something is considered the lifton of something else, where the primary Achila is one thing, and the other thing becomes Tofel, even if it's the majority in quantity, because it's an enhancer of the Ikka. And we will see Be'ez Hashem in Rishonim that it's possible that the primacy of Chameshes Minim means that whatever's mixed with Chameshes Minim is always considered an enhancer of the Chameshes Minim. In other words, to summarize, we're proposing three models, three possibilities by which the Chashivos of Chameshes Minim will conform with the rules of Ikar and Tofel. Because it's the properties of Chameshes Minim that either make it his Ikar Kavanas for that, or it's for Tam, or that everything else in the Tarevis is Lalafis, the Chameshes Minim. So now let's progress through the Shittas Rishonim, and we'll try and show how different Rishonim seem to assume different Mahalchim in this key question in the Sugya. So again, our working assumption is Lule the Pnei Yeshua, that the Pnei Yeshua seems to assume that the Chashivos of the mean itself, because of Birchas Hamazon and Chala and Matzah, allows Chameshes Minim to defy the rules of Tofel and Ikar. What we'll try and show from the Rishonim is that it conforms to the rules of Tofel and Ikar, but the unique properties of Chameshes Minim make it either Ikar Kavanosoi, or because it's Latam, or because it's considered a Lafis. So let's now progress the Siyata D'Shmaya through the Rishonim. So one of the Rishon that there are two Rishonim that deal with this question primarily, as it was in the Maramachemis sheet, was the Rosh and the Rashba. And we'll begin with the Shita of the Rosh on page 25 of the book, of the Maramachemis booklet. And the Rosh is in Siman Zayin. So that's the right-hand column, about 4 lines from the top of the page, begins the words of the Rosh, Dibra Maskal Chovitz. So if you begin 4 lines into that Rosh, the Rosh summarizes the halacha based on the Rif. V'chein hilchasa, the halacha is on Chovitz ke'indaisa, the halacha is bari minim mezonos. And the reason why, he says, hilkach, the emerging principle from this Gemara is this: kol she'ikroi mechameshes minim, afilu ruboy mimin acher, mevarchim olav bari minim mezonos ulvasoy bracha achas me'in shalish. The Rosh says something very difficult and very vague. He says the reason why it's bari minim mezonos is because ikroi mechameshes minim afilu ruboy mimin acher. He says if it's only been placed, it's only for devek. In that case, it's not ikar. Devek means that the kemach is only there to serve everything else in the tarevis. But zot the rosh, as long as the kemach is ikar, then in that case, even though it's the miut, the halacha still is that it's going to be a bari minim mezonos. What does that mean that the kemach is the ikar? It's not the ikar. The Gemara said the dvash is the ikar, and the Pnei Yeshua said in terms of the rules of Tofel and Ikar, the dvash is the Ikar. Good. So let's see how that happens. But the Rosh doesn't give us a definition of how that din of Ikar comes about. So let's begin with a fascinating shaila that the Rishonim ask. On page 49 of the Maramachemis booklets is the Rif on our Gemara. I apologize. On page 48. I apologize. Page 48 in the pages of the Maramachemis. So on the margins of the Rabbeinu Yonah is the Shitas Rivov. We'll begin the Rivov a little over halfway down the column on the left-hand side of the page. After the colon, the words begin the Koit Derav Kahana. Page 48 in the book's pages. Zog the Rivov, the kol mean. Tabshel sheyesh bo mechameshes haminim afu v'sheyesh bo tabshel min acher shehu ikar. The other mean is clearly ikar. Zok the Rivov mevarchim ala bari minim mezonos v'hilchas hakabasei derav kahana. He says v'loy mitame, not because of the reason that Rav Kahana says the Omar smida ikar. Note what the Rivov said. We were assuming until now that we are holding like Rav Kahana that the smida is ikar. Zot the Rivov, no, the smida is not ikar. Of course, the dvash is ikar. The general rules of ikar and tofel tell us the dvash is ikar. So what's the reason why that it's like Rav Kahana? The Omar smida ikar, the afagab the dub sheikar mebarchim alabin mezonos. Why? Zot the Rivov, v'hani mili kisha oisei min mechameshes minim. Me'urav betavshel litin tam. Aval imhu betavshel l'shar dvarim V'shaloi litin tam b'tavshil mevorach ala ikar. So the Rivov gives us the first classification of what creates ikar in the case of chameshes minim, and the answer is because it becomes it's placed in the tavshil for tam. So even if the dvash is ikar, but when it's placed for tam, then the rule is what's placed as the primary tam of the tavshil becomes ikar. So in terms of what we're aware of in the general principles, dvash is ikar. When Rav Kahana said that the chameshes minim is ikar, it's not true. It's not the loy mitam, maybe not passing like Rav Kahana. That's not correct. The reason is because where it's placed for tam, chameshes minim placed for tam means that becomes the ikar tam of the tavshil. As I state in the Shittas HaRivav. And he brings at the end, very last line, we'll just jump, he says, so that Rambam which we began with, the Rambam says that as long as it's placed for tam, it remains ikar. The Rambam doesn't just mean to exclude ladabik. Says the Rivav, the Rambam is telling us how kol sheyesh boy conforms with the rules of ikar and tofel. The reason why it's ikar, says the Rivav, is because it was placed for tam. Tam of chameshes minim remains ikar. Now, what's the proof of the Rivav? So he brings a fascinating proof. He says, we have later on a din. He says, v'kashili l'svarazu. If we're going to say that chameshes minim always remains in ikar, so then how do we understand the following halacha? It's a Mishnah. Heviu lefon of moliach upas. Someone was given something which is too salty to eat plain. So he was given bread to be able to eat in order to take away the saltiness, the sharpness in the mouth. So there the halacha is, mavarach ala maliach, you make the bracha that the maliach requires, upoiter es pas, and the lechem is potter. Frek the Rivav, how could the lechem be potter? Kol sheyesh by chameshes minim, the chameshes minim is always ikar. Here we have a case where not just kemach becomes a tofel, but pas becomes a tofel. How could pas become a tofel? On that, the Rivav answers, and he says the reason for that is Elo yesh loymar, the beginning of the very wide lines. Zeh shebo Rabbi Shmuel elamdeinu shekol tavshil shemu'urav mehem lechameshes minim litein tam betavshil. Oise hamin choshev leikar mipnei chashivusay umevarich olav im hu nosun betavshil l'shadvarim v'shaloi litin tam einei choshev leikar. Zot the Rivav, that's my proof. The reason why it has to be in the tavshil is because it has to enhance the tavshil. Once it enhances the tavshil, that enhancement is the ikar of the tavshil. Masha'enkin, if I'm eating it together, so we don't see the function of the pas except to just mitigate the peh, but not for tam. Zot the Rivav, if it's not giving tam, where is its chashivus? So we have now in the Rivav again, mafurish like in the Rambam. It's not that chameshes minim defy the dinim of tam and ikar. It's that where the tam is a tam of chameshes minim, that tam becomes the ikar tam in the tavshil. But we see a chiddush in the Rivav that we require no more than tam. That's all. No more than tam. As long as the chameshes minim are nice in tam b'tavshil, that by definition makes them an ikar. If it's not nice in tam, there's no reason why, just because by definition chameshes minim are present in the taroives, that becomes chashuv. This is the din of the Rivav. Now, that the Rosh doesn't mention anything about tam. The Rosh says because it's placed there as an ikar, and never gives us this hagdara of the Rivav for tam. So the Davik doesn't work. Correct. So correct. So that's the diak of the Rivav, that everything besides the Davik. His example of a clear halacha where it wouldn't apply would be Ladavik. But what we'll see in the poskim is that since the Rosh doesn't give us that precise hagdara of the Rivav, which is just for tam, and is more vague and calls it ikar, we will need a different hagdara in the Rosh. So whereas the Rivav shows us a Rambam where his reading of the Rambam is that time is enough, in the Rosh we don't have that reading either. So to summarize the point we've reached, we've been working with the Hanacha consistently that Chameshes minim conform with the dinim of Iker Tofel, just their unique properties make them Iker, but conforming to the general principles. The Rivav is saying wherever something is placed in the Tavshil Latam, that becomes the Tam Choshev of the Tavshil, and therefore it's Ovid Latam. So the same way as we'll see in Shulchan Aruch, that even not in the case of Chameshes minim, if something is placed as a primary Tam of the Tavshil, that becomes an Iker. The Rivav is saying whenever Chameshes minim are placed in a Tavshil Latam, they become the primary Tam of the Tavshil, and therefore they become Iker.
Not the Chameshes minim anyway.
Correct. The difference is correct. The difference Chameshes minim is that as long as Chameshes minim are put in for tam, even if other things are put in for tam as well, Chameshes minim remains a dominant tam. And I'm glad you brought out that point clearly. And we'll see this borne out in the poskim. As long as it's placed for tam, that becomes a dominant tam of the tafshil. But the way it conforms to the principles of ikra tofel is because we have a general principle that the tam of the tafshil becomes ikra. That's what we see in the Rivav. Now, we said that the question that forced the Rivav to be mechadish this reasoning of Tam was because if we'll say that by definition Chameshes minim defy the rules of Ikra and Tofel, then why is it if you eat pas together with Moliach is the pas of Tofel? The Chashivas itself should mean that that's always the brach. We find, and I apologize, I didn't have a chance to copy this in the Maram Komis. I'll just read out a couple of sentences in the Chidushim of the Ra'ah. The Ra'ah at the end of the Sugya on the Lamed Zayin and Beis Hashem, we'll get there, asks the same question at the end of the sugya. If we've established now the principle which the psak follows, that kol sheyesh boy chameshes minim remains an ikr, how do we understand the Mishnah of Maliach and Pas? So the Ra'ah answers differently, and he says the difference is that in the case of Maliach and Pas, they're not mixed. They're being eaten one and then the other separately. Whereas the din of kol sheyesh boy is only where it's betaroivus, where there's a mixture. Why? He says v'tama de milsa. He says dikishuhu betaroivus, when it's mixed into a taroivus, afiluhu ma'at, even if in quantity it's the minority, mikol mokom leikir tavshil hushon. It's being placed there as the primary ingredient. So before we read further, we now see very different from the Rivav. The Rivav, based on the Rambam, says it's because it's placed as tam. The Ra'ah says because Chameshes minim, but always remain primary, because the intent of placing them in the taroives is for the consumption of the Chameshes minim. He says the time of the milsa kshuba taroives leikad tavshel husham. Even if the other kinds are majority, if we would apply the rules of Ikra Tafel, they would be Ikr. What's new in this Ra'ah is this Lashon that it's been placed there to be the primary ingredient. And we will see in a moment that the Mishnah Berurah himself is medayek this in the Ra'ah, that the intent of its inclusion in the tafshil is for it to become the ikar. Not because memela its presence makes it ikar like the Bnei Yeshua. It's correct, and we'll see a lot in the Mishnah Berurah that depends on its kavanah. And we'll get there step by step. First, let's establish basic parameters in the Rishonim. Whereas the Ra'ah describes the function as tam, the Ra'ah says it's the presence of Chameshes minim becomes the ikar tafshil. He says, Masha'inkin, while you're eating pas and moliach, what's the purpose of the pas? It's the ikar tafshil usham. It's there, lamatik is piv. It's to remove the bitterness, the saltiness. But therefore, it's not the ikar tafshil usham. So from the Ra'ah, we have a different definition. That the reason why Chameshes minim conform with the principle of taroives is because we mentioned that in the dinim of ikar taroives we have ikar kavanosai for the tofel, gives it the bracha, and we saw that as we mentioned in the sugi of shemen and anigroin, that even if the anigron is roiv, since your kavanas for the shemen, the bracha follows the shemen. Zok the Ra'ah, the kavana of the person placing the Chameshes minim is that should be ikra tafshil. That's what we see in the lashon of the Ra'ah. If we want to see this borne out, we can see this borne out in the lashon of the Taz. On page 272 in the Maram Makomis book is the lashon of the Taz in the beginning of Siman Reish Ches. So it's on the left-hand side of the page, the spine side of the page, Sifkoton Gimel in the Taz. So the Taz tells us first the Taz quantifies the din of Iker, and then the Taz says a Chiddush. He says, Kan b'chamesh aminim shem chashuvim beyoyser le'azinu basaroiv, rak kol shenoisnin oisoy lema'achol. It's being made as a meichel. It's being made to be consumed.
New term.
Correct. Kol shenoisnin oisoy lema'achol. Now, mikoyach that the Taz is mechadish, that not just can we now, and we're saying the makar of the Taz is in this ra'ah, is the ikr because it's being placed l'meichel. That's what the person primarily wants to consume. But zok the Taz, we now can go a step further and say, and this addresses your question, that even if we don't even perceive the tam of the chameshes minim, the tam has been completely dominated by whatever there is in the tamshel. But since the chameshes minim is primary ma'achol, and it was placed in the tamshel for ma'achol, that becomes the classification of this taroivis. It's a ma'achol of chameshes minim. Therefore, says the Taz, we no longer require tam. And therefore he says, mashma dekan afilu einoisnin tam sheyesh lem chashivos kiven shehem lemeichol. And zok the Taz, I have a proof from the Gemara. What's the Gemara's case? Dvash ikr. He says, if the majority in a tarovis is dvash, what are you tasting? Are you tasting the smida or are you tasting dvash? Tasting dvash. Zok the Taz, oy bazoi the emargish rak tam dvash. That's the dominant tam. So Zok the Taz, what we see from here is a different Hagdara. That if it's put in the Tavshel Lemachol, then that becomes the classification of this Meichel. This is a Meichel of Chameshis Minim. And therefore, that is the Mechuvan of it, it's being placed, and therefore we don't even require Tam. So we've now established two Mahalchim in the Rishonim, the Rivov and the Rambam, that where it's placed for Tam, that by definition, because of the Chashivas of Chameshes Minim, becomes dominant Tam, and that's how it conforms to Ikr and Tofel. Whereas according to the Taz, it's because it's Nitan L'Meichel. Rabbi Shlomo was asking before, where do we see it's totally on the Kavanah of the Noisein? Let's see a Sharat Tziyun. The Sharat Tziyun is on page 301 of the Maramukhemis pages.
Also flour and the filter fish, that would be lamachal, so you would make
well, there it's being used for binding. There it's being used for binding. And since it's not placed lamachal or a filler, so filler will have to get to. Let's see a Sharat Tziyun. So the Sharat Tziyun is on page 301 on the far margin of the page. There's a column Sharat Tziyun, and we're in Siman Reish Yud Beis, and we're in Sifkot on Dalad. So see, Reish Yud Beis, there's a break in the column, and then there's Siman Reish Yud Beis, Sifkot on Dalad. V'ayin b'chidushe hara'ah shehizbir lanu hatam. The Sharat Tziyun is discussing, this halacha is the din that when someone eats moliach, he doesn't make a bracha on the pass. So the Sharat Tziyun is asking, why? Kol sheyesh bo, there's chameshes minim here. Why should the pass be a tofel? So Zot the Sharat Tziyun, I found the ra'ah. What does it say in the ra'ah? Zot there, v'ayim b'chidushe shehizbir lanu hatam, lama le'inin taroives, shu gam kem mitam ikr b'tofel, kaimel on the chameshes minim afilu miut hema ikr la'olam, ub'she'ei murovim afilu pas tofel upon the kosav. The ra'ah writes, the ksheim b'taroives ayrin le'inin chashibus b'tavshel ve'amrinon. And Reb Shlomo note the lashon of the Sharat Tziyun. The kshesom b'toichay minei dogon som oison le'ikr b'tavshel. Nifla. The Chafetz Chaim b'mesek l'shoinai has said that the intent of the person placing them in the tavshel is that they should be the ikr. Nifla.
Even though the HaRav is objective and not protected.
No, so that's the Nakuda. The Nakuda is that if they were placed in the tavshel, what we then understand is as long as, and this addresses your question, as long as they weren't placed ladabik, then the intention was to benefit from the mozin property of the dogon. And it's the chashivas of the mozin property, which therefore means I'm going to consume it primarily for the intention of the mozin. So now we can model the din of ikr and tofel, so to speak, after one of the dinim we discussed before, which wherever the ikr intention is for that ingredient, that by definition makes it ikr. So we have now a broad machlokes rishonim to summarize. The Ra'ah, the Rivov and the Rambam is tam, and the Ra'ah says nifla that my das placing it in the tavshel for the purpose of mozin classifies it as a tavshel of mozin. That's how the Mishnah Berurah read, the Sharat Tziyun read the Ra'ah. Lashon nifla. And he says,
We have a good Molekach and the Bonus.
"Oisen leike betafshel kehim chashum beyoyse mashe ein king shem mufrodim kein maslis in the past einu ikke klal."
We have a good Molekach. Other issues with Brian Iker that Kavana is.
Not Iker, but we discussed in last week's limud not the adai to the hachi defines what the Iker toyalis of something is. So we have the aspin keveh and brachos, which is discussed by Erich last week. So we're not without parallel in Hilchos brachos. But this is a dover nifla that's mavur in the sharatzim, that the Ra'ah understands that primarily it was placed in the tavshil for the purpose of mosing. If we want to show a smach to this from the Rishonim, not all Achreinim understand this way, but if we now return to the Omud of the Gemara that we began with on page 4 of the book, and we look on the right hand side, the very last Tosfos on the Omud, Dibar Amaschil Kol. Tosfos, towards the end of Tosfos, discusses a case of shkedim sha'osim l'choyle. So they are shkedim that are mixed with kemach, which are mixed with flour. It was some type of preparation which was considered to have medicinal benefit, which was prepared for a choyle. And it's a mixture of almonds and flour. So says Tosfos, im oisin oisoi kidei sheyisoid halev oz tzarich boire mine mezonos. He says, if we want, even though in this case the shkedim are the roiv and the kemach is there, and often, as is clear in the Hemshech of Tosfos, the kemach is often placed there only in order to be medabik, only in order to create a solid. But nonetheless, says Tosfos, if the kemach was added lisoid es alev, so even if the roiv is shkedim, but if it was added lisoid es alev, that creates ikr. So we see mafurish in Tosfos that the intent of benefiting from the kemach, lisoid es alev, which presumably is the benefit for the choyle, that alone creates ikr. So again, we see this yisoid of the Sharat Zion, that where it's placed in the taroives to be beneficial from the taroives, that's what allows it to become an ikr. If we have time, perhaps we'll see other chenim understood differently. But this is the yisoid which we are extracting from the Ra'ah, copy the Taz and the Sharat Zion, that wherever it's placed l'maichol, that becomes the ikr, and that's what Tosfos means when he says that it's placed lisoid es alev. Now, we'll pause for a moment, and now we'll go back to the Pnei Yeshua that we began with. The Pnei Yeshua proved that the basis of the Chameshes Minim being Iker is not because of their function as their property of being Mozain, because he said in a Taroives, where something else is the Roiv and the Iker, we assume that the Chameshes Minim are not functioning as Mozain, therefore it must by definition be their Chashivus, which is because of mitzvahs challah and mitzvahs matzah and birchas hamazon. And therefore, once it's their chashivah, not the Pnei Yeshua that defies the dinim of ikr and tafel. What we see from the Rishonim, though, from the Ra'ah, from the way the Taz is muvur, from the way Tosfos seems to be muvur, that even if something is the miut, it still functions as mozain. And not just can it function as mozain, it can be placed in the taroives to be the primary benefit of consuming the taroives. So whereas Yeshua assumed that something but taroives, if there's a roiv, loses its property of mozain, from the Ra'ah, the way the Sharat Zion understands, from the Taz, that it's Nitzal L'Maichel, from Tosfos, that Soyed Es Halev, we see that it can remain with its mozain property, even though it's betaroives. So therefore, we have a mokum to be done, to discuss, al pi the Rishonim, the very premise that the Pnei Yeshua makes from the Sugya, that it must by definition be the classification of Chameshes Aminim as something with which one has chashivos because one's Mekayim mitzvahs. The Rishonim see to muvur, it can retain its property of mozain, even if it's a miyot. Imkain, we can now go back and say the Rosh that we read, that the Rosh said that where it's placed in a taroives, if it's ikr, it has a bracha. And we ask, what's this definition of ikr? So the Taz has given us a definition. Ikr means when it's placed in the tavshil, like you said, not the dabek, which then means the intent is not mozain, but as long as it's placed in the tavshil to be an ikr, which means it's placed for its mozain property, it by definition remains an ikr. So we have a very clear beer in the Rosh. Now, just to add another nukuda, which again is to address your question. The Rosh says, as long as it's placed as an ikr. The Rosh mentions nothing about tam, nothing. The Rivov and the Rambam were the ones that mentioned tam. The Taz therefore was medayik, as we pointed out before, that as long as it has a mozon property, meaning it's placed on Meichel, we don't need to perceive in any way the impact that the Kemach has on the Tam. Tam is irrelevant. Someone could eat it, they could take a taste test, they would say there's no Chameshes Minim in it, even though it's present, and it has nutritional benefit. If it doesn't have Tam, that doesn't change anything, b'negea to the Chashivos of a Kol Sheyesh Bo. The Bir Halacha, and this is in the Mar Mekayim's book, is on page 281. So the Bir Halacha is towards the bottom of the page, last third of the page is the Bir Halacha, and we'll be focusing on Dibra Masl Mevarech Tchila Bar Min Mazonos. Here, the Bir Halacha is discussing the din that he says in Mishnah Berurah, that in order to be able to have the bracha bar mazonos, one does require that the dogon have some tam. One has to, some tam. One has to in some way sense the tam of dogon. Not like the taz. So we'll pick up the Bir Halacha in the towards the bottom of the first column. He brings a number of achreinim and he says, after midivri ataz. Bereish Siman Zeh, Ubereish Siman Reish Beis, Mashma, Deloy Bo Yinon Shiyeh Bo Tam Dogon. Kvar Tomu Olo B'Sefer Mati Yehuda B'Sefer Nishmas Adam De'inu Raya Klal. The Taz brought a raya from Dvash. Seems to be a very strong proof. Zad the Bir Halacha the Afilu B'Mu'ur of Dvash Yochel Hargish Ktsas Tam Dogon. So this is a very important point that the Bir Halacha is saying. Meaning, not to make the mistake that the Bir Halacha means that we need two conditions for Chameshes meaning to be Iker. One, the Rosh, that it has to be put Lemozin, and two, the Rivov and the Rambam, that it has to be put for Tam. We don't. The Mishnah Berurah, the Bir Halacha is just saying that if we can't be Margish the Tam at all, then by definition, we can't consider it Iker. Now, this is a fascinating Chiddush, because based on the Svaras of the Ra'ah and the Sharat Tzion and the Taz, why should Tam matter? What makes it Iker is because the Iker Kavonas for that, like the Sharat Tzion said, it was placed in the Taroives Kadei to benefit from the Mozon. So why do we need Tam? But the Mishnah Berurah says, it brings a Chevel Achronim that argue on the Taz. And he says, V'gam ba'agoyis hagrach tzanze, ba'agoyis of Reb Chaim Tzanze. That's the earlier Reb Chaim Tzanze, not the Divrei Chaim. It's the earlier Reb Chaim Tzanze, ala Taz. V'gam mi divrei harosh. And he says, even the Rosh requires Tam. Why? He says, "Shekosav kol sheikra mechameshes minim mashma da al kolponim bo'inon sheyeh boitam dogon di ilav hochi ein shaykh klau lekroisay ikra." Zad the Bir Halacha Svar. He says, don't make the mistake of saying that because the Rosh didn't mention Tam, and he said as long as it's placed there as an ikr, it means like what we were suggesting until now, like they were all on the Taz, that as long as it was placed there for Muslim, it by definition becomes the ikr. Says the Bir Halacha, you're making a mistake. In Svara, something that doesn't provide at least a Tam enhancer, an enhancement of Tam, can't be by definition be considered an Iker.
You have to feel the flavor.
When it has in the Lashon is lahargish ktsas Tam dogon. Now this is a machlekes in Svara. It's a machlekes in Svara because the Lashon of the Rosh is not Muchra. The Lashon of the Ra'ah doesn't mention Tam. The Chafetz Chaim's own Svara and Sharat Tzion is because it's placed in the Lashon. That makes it Iker. Zod Chafetz Chaim, Reb Chaim Tzanzer holds, even b'shittas Rosh, that even though the Rosh doesn't mention Tam, nothing can be considered Iker unless one, it satisfies the criteria of Tam, and two, that it's put there at least to be the Mosin of the Tasha. V'hu nifla. This is a chiddush of the Bir Halacha. Lule the Bir Halacha, we perhaps would have been matziyah that the pashtus of the Rishonim al pi the Ra'ah is more like the Taz. But Bir Halacha shteit nish. And therefore the Dina, if something is mixed, and it's a very, very important halacha, if something is mixed so that it's not murgish Tam dogon at all, therefore there'll be no bracha b'rim min mazonos. No bracha at all.
The one is by the back. If the camera is there to dilute the sweetness.
Yes. Yes, that would also be considered that with murgash tam. Tam means it has some time impact. It doesn't have to mean that it becomes the ikr tam, as is clear in the Lashon of the Bir Halacha. Even what in Hilchas Tarubas is called kiyua, which means it's a subtle in the language of the Vintner, it would have overtones, right? Overtones, right, of something, right, of taste, which is kiyua ba'alman, the Lashon of the Rishonim. That still would be considered enough because akaponim the tam is murgash. But once the tam is not murgash, then zot the Bir Halacha, it just can't be ikr at all. So it's poshut that the entire discussion of the Rosh only begins once we assume that there's some time.
Of course you feel.
We'll get to give in a moment. Let's get good. So, Rabbi said, just before we start, how we put time, Shlomo? I'm sorry?
52.
52. Okay. Then base. So, Rabbi said, let's just try and finish the Yesodus of the Sugi, and then we'll try and see if we can discuss applications. Now.
I have a short shot. When you put the fish, you put the camera. You take away the face of the fish. Or anti-tam is also tam.
Because the reason, how does anti-tam work? It doesn't dissolve tam. It creates a counter-tam. So you're being magish to tam. Yeah. It creates a counter-tam. It doesn't. We don't dilute tam. We just add another tam that then becomes dominant. It's a counter-tam. This is you say that's Mavur and Rishonim in the Sugi Tam Ke'ikir. It's not. We can dilute quantities but we can't. Is that correct? Is that correct? It's a counter time. Right? It doesn't dilute time. You have a chemist in the audience. You have to be technically. You have to be technically rigorous. So the question now remains is that if, as we've said, whether we fully follow the mahalach of the achronim just for the purpose of discussion that one requires tam and that it was placed l'maychal or l'mazon, or we just follow the taz that it was just placed l'maychal is enough, which then gives it its chashivus. The question then is, oiras and doichan, we know are also mazon because we make a bar minim mezenis on them. We know that tmorim are zon. We had a Gemara like that earlier. Tmorim are zon. The Gemara Daf Yud Beis. We know that yayin can be soyed and has properties of zon and soy, the discussion of the Gemara. So if it follows then that it's because it's being placed primarily as mozoin, which is the benefit of consuming it, so why then, if we put oiras and doichan in a taroives, does it not also remain with its mozoin property such that it should have the din of ikar? So Reb Shlomo is answering, it's min dogon. But our avekshtel is to say that there's nothing in min dogon but a unique mozaim property or a unique tam property. So why shouldn't oiras and doichan have the same thing?
So we'll tell you dogon, not oiras and dogon. You put meat in it.
Meat is not mazin, but anything that has a bracha bori minim azoynes should have the mila of dogon. So if one is ma'ayin carefully in the lashon of the Pnei Yeshua, it's mavur that the Pnei Yeshua uses that to establish his fact that in taroives we lose mozain. Because he says if that wouldn't be true, then oiras and doichan, just like be'en they have a bar mizaynus, should have a b'taroives. So the Pnei Yeshua al korach b'taroives, that doesn't happen. So, but since we seemingly are showing from both the Rishonim and the Achronim that that's not the case, like the simple reading, the simple assumption of the Pnei Yeshua. So how do we answer this question? So in order to, we can suggest, and this will finish with the two possibilities. We had mentioned that another instance in which a taroives, despite roiv being to one way, the miut can be an ikar is because it's lalafes. Everything else in the taroives is there to enhance the miut. And wherever that's the case, the ikar remains ikar. If you're ma'ayin in the lashon of the tour in Simon Reish Ches, one doesn't require to see the lashon inside. I'll just read out a sentence. The arichas of the lashon is not relevant to us in the tour. The tour establishes that chameshes haminim have a chashivus of a bracha lifneihem, because they're bari minim, because they are bari minim zonos, because chameshes minim of dogon can be used to create pas. It can create pas. It says oid yesh lahem mayla ki aleim yichya ha'adam v'im osa mehem pas mevarach hamoitzi. So since chameshes haminim is the ikir chiyus of the adam in the form of pas, and when it's made into pas, it has its own bracha. So therefore, even if it's in its less processed form, namely it's just a tavshel of chameshes haminim, it has already a chashivas of a bracha b'fnei atzmai. Therefore, the Torah says, and he says, Hilkoch afilu loy osa mehem pas elo tavshel. And even if you're ma'ariv shar minim, so that the shar minim should be ikr, still the din is that it has the chashivos as though it were pas. What does that mean? We know pas can become a tofel. Moliach says that pas can become a tofel. Zok the Tur, chameshes minim, even if they're not in the form of pas, they are a me'ein of pas. They're a precursor of pas. So pas has its own bracha and pas remains in ikr. So therefore the precursor to pas, says the Tur, has its own bracha and remains in ikr. What the Tur seems to be saying is that whenever something else is mixed into a tarovis of chameshes minim, in the same way as we introduced the concept of lifton, of lalafes, that whenever something is eaten in a suda, everything else that's eaten is considered a lalafes as a pas. It's considered an accompaniment and an enhancer of the pas. So too, whenever chameshes haminim are in the tavshil, everything else in the tavshil is lifton of the chameshes haminim. Even if one puts HaRav into the tavshil, it's there to enhance the kemach. The same way as pas remains the ikr, and therefore everything else is lifton of the pas, so too where the chameshes minim, which are me'ein of pas, everything else remains lifton. That's what we could derive from the Torah. That therefore answers the Pnei Yeshua's question, why by uras v'doichan in a tarovis, mozin isn't sufficient. Because the basis of where it's put into mozin doesn't just mean because it's ikka kavanosif in the mozin. It means because everything else therefore becomes tofel, like pas of lifton. And we'll just end with what it says in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, in both the Luach of Birchas Hanenin and in Hilchas Birchas Hanenin, where the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says that wherever something was put in a tarovis, together with chameshes haminim, he says, since chameshes haminim are called primary mozon, so therefore everything else put in is just there as part of the way of consuming mozon. So again, we see this yisoid that even though oiras v'doichan can have the property of being mozain, but Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, it's only by the chameshes minim, which are primary mozain, that we see that everything else is just placed there as an enhancement of the mozain. So ba'ofen, the point that we'll now conclude the halacha part of the limud is that we began with the Pnei Yeshua that the chashivas chameshes minim defies the rules of ikr and tofel, and what we tried and showed from the Rishonim is that we have a number of mahalchim how it's the chameshes haminim, because of their unique property, conform with the rules of chameshes haminim, just their unique application of chameshes haminim, either because the tam of Dagon remains choshev in the tarovis, or because mozin remains choshev in the tarovis, or because his ikr kavana is for the chameshes haminim. That's the chelek of the chelek halacha which we wanted to discuss. And that will be a summary now of the sugya of kol sheyesh bo, in terms of the three key approaches that we've established in the Rishonim to this sugya. Just to end with Divrei Agad. The parashiyos of Mechiras Yosef surround the Yontif of Chanukah. Parashas Vayeshev precedes Chanukah. Shabbos Chanukah is Miketz and sometimes Yigash, and then after Chanukah we have the soif of that Ma'aseh. We will recall that in the Divrei Agada that we discussed at the beginning of Chodesh Kislev, we discussed what is Mavur and Sefer Yetzirah as expounded on and elaborated by Reb Tzadok in Pri Tzadik, that the ois in the Aleph Beis that corresponds to Chodesh Kislev is the ois of Samach, and the function of the guf that corresponds is the function of Shena. Himlech ois Samach will connect the Shena baguf, is the Girs of the Arizal in Sefer Yetzirah. And we explain that Shena always represents the person in a matzav of ruchnius yerida. Ani Shena v'libi er, Yeshnai am echad. Shena always represents Klal Yisrael in their state of imperfection in terms of their ruchnis madrega. So too, we said it represents Kiviyachol, the Rebbeinu Shalom, withholding his shefa. Ura lomo sishan Hashem. So when we speak about Shena, we speak about Klal Yisrael in a state of being more limited in ruchnius, more hidden from the shefa of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That was quoting Reb Tzadok, yeah.
Where?
The Reb Tzadok is in Chodesh Kislev, which is after Pashas Vayishlach Ois Dal. So too, we mentioned that in Oisias the Rebbe Kiva it's Mavur, and it has a Makor in Zohar HaKadosh, that the Ois of Samach in the Aleph Beis corresponds to the Midah of the Rebbeinu Shalom of Soymech Hashem L'chol HaNoifim. So therefore, Chodesh Kislev is that Klal Yisrael in the Zman of Shena, in the Zman of Nefila, there is a specific anhaga of Soymech Hashem L'chol HaNoifim, where the Rebbeinu Shalom nonetheless allows Klal Yisrael to regenerate and revive and rebound from a state of Shena. Geula from a state of Shena. And Reb Tzadok explained that Shena is something which is associated with Laila. It says, Ivri Leila El L'Shin, so the Gemara says in Erevim. Kislev was the Zman of the Gezerah of Yavon, Shehichshichu Eseineim Shel Yisrael. Medrash Rabbah in the beginning of Bereshis, V'choshech Hapanei Tohim Zu Yavon. Memele Zokter Tzadok, that's what the Sefer Yetzirah is referring to. It refers to the ability of Klal Yisrael in Choshech, Al Yidei, the Hanhaga of Soymech Hashem L'chol HaNoiflim, to be able to be Zeicha once again to Or. More than that, Tzadok said, the Nefila itself often becomes the catalyst for the Aliyah. It was Gufa, the Gezeres HaYevonim, which eventually drove Klal Yisrael to be Moise Nefesh for Shabbos and Chodesh and Milah and Torah and Avodah B'Mikdash, as is explained in the Bach in the beginning of Hilchos Chanukah. And it was that Mesiras Nefesh Gufa which the Bach says generated the Nes, which then brought back the oil that Klal Yisrael didn't have in the Choshech of Yom. So this is the Yesod of Reb Tzadok. The Yesod of Reb Tzadok can actually be found in the Lashon of Rabbeinu Yonah in the beginning of Shar Beis, where Rabbeinu Yonah says that a person can be moichel Hashem b'ma'oif tzukasa. A person can always be makaver. The person always has the means by which he can be assured that he will be able to extricate himself from the tzukah, because he says sheyiyah hachoshech sibas ha'oira. The choshech itself becomes the catalyst for oil, and therefore, by definition, if he's being yoshev b'choshech, the choshech itself contains the elements to regenerate oil, and therefore, if he finds himself Zot Rabbeinu Yonah in an oifen of nefila, sheva yipol tzadik v'kom. Ilmole noifalti loikamti. The kimo itself has its shoyresh and its koyach in the nefila itself. Where is the makar for this concept of Rabbeinu Yonah? That the kivui in an eis tzara is because the tzara itself contains the siba for the oir. I would suggest that the makar is in a medrash in the Maisa of the Mechiras Yosef.
Where?
The medrash is in Pashas Miketz in Medrash Rabbah, where the medrash on the words Loma Hari Oisemli, when the Achim come back and they ask Yaakov to send Binyamin. So he says, Loma Hari Oisemli, why did you do raw to me by telling the Moshel that there was another Ach, and now he's demanding that you bring him down to prove the veracity of the claim. Zot the medrash Lo Omar Me Oilam Yaakov Dovar Echad Levatala Chutz Mizu. It's called a dovar levatala. Omar me oilam le Omar Yaakov dovar levatala chutz mizu. Hu oimer loma hari oisem li va'ani osuk laham leches b'noim. Now, if the medrash is saying it's a dovar levatala, that means that it wasn't just that when Yaakov said loma hari oisem li lebasoif there would be toiv. It means that the very thing that he's describing as Ra is the very Siba for Toiv. We can understand that sometimes Ra has to perhaps temporarily exist because Labasoif there'll be Toiv. Or we have to understand that Toiv can exist despite the Ra or in concurrent with the Ra. What state in Medrash is that what Yaakov was calling Ra was itself the Toiv. The shoyresh of the nisoid of Rabbeinu Yonah, that the nefila itself is the siba for the kima. The gezerah itself of Yavon generated the Mesiras Nefesh of Klal Yisrael, such that the tzara itself became the cause. That has its shoyresh in the parasha of Mechiras Yosef. The Chazal say it's Omar Dovar Levatala. Omar Dover Levatolo. Who Oimer Lama Hari Oisem Li Vani Osuk Laham Leches B'nai Melech. That very Maisa itself is the generator of the Eitza Amuka Me Oise Zokin of Yishlacheu Me Emek Hebron. Memela, that's the time that these parashas are around the Nes of Chanukah, because the avodah of Chodesh Kislev is this limud. Hu oimer lama hori oisem li vani osuk laham leches b'nai melech. It's a dover levatolo, because there isn't a hanhaga that says that Ra can exist because eventually it will be replaced by Tov. The midah of Soimech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim means nefila itself has to be a generator of kamti. The oimek of the midah of Soimech Hashem l'chol hanoiflim is that the nefila itself contains in it the generator of the kim. The choshech of Yavan itself was his sibas ha'or. In Lashon Rabbeinu Yonah, sheyeh ha'choshech sibas ha'or. Siba means the cause. Nifla. So the makor of Rabbeinu Yonah is a medrash, and the smichus to the parashas of Chanukah is because Heimei Madvar. The oimek of the choshech of Yavan itself generated the midah of Mesiras Nefesh B'Klal Yisrael, which is itself the siba for the nes. And therefore, it's dafka in these parashas that we have this midah. The shlichus of Yosef from Vayishlacheu Me'emek Hebron is l'kayim atzos shel Osei Zoken doesn't just mean that it would set off a chain of events which eventually would end with the Yerida. Atem chashavtem l'ro v'Hashem chashava l'toiva. Sof Parshas Vayechi. It doesn't just mean that the Rebbeinu Shalom took the Ra and turned it into Tov. It means that was the Eitza Amukah, that was the Machshava of the Rebbeinu Shalom himself. There's a fascinating nidin in Rabbeinu Bachya for Nort. If Yosef was ever moichal the Achim for what they did, Rabbeinu Bachya is done in the Shaila. It's nidin because later there was nitva in Asar Harugi Malchus. And the Rabbeinu Bachya's diuk is because we never find that Yosef himself said that Amoichel. He just said Ha'elokim chashava l'toiva. To diuk nifel. But the Yesod Hadvarim is what Yosef was telling the Achim is that the Maisa, the Basoif, there wasn't an element of Ra in what they did. That doesn't change necessarily if it does require Mechila or not, because Atem Chashavtem, and for that alone, there's a concept of Kapara. But the Ha'elokim chashava l'toiva means chashava l'toiva doesn't mean it was returned to Toiv. Chashava l'toiva means it was considered in the moment itself as a double Toiv. That limud is the limud of the smichos of these parashas to the parish of Chanukah, to the Moed of Chanukah.
2 minutes.